thank you all for being here. Darren, I've known Darren, by the way, for many years. I was on the board of Ford Foundation for many years, and so it's a great thrill and honor to have Darren here. And before we start, though, I also want to call out, I'm going to embarrass him a little bit, Richard Fisher and his wife, Missy. And Richard ran the Dallas Fed for, you're going to have to stand up, I'm sorry.
Stand up, Richard.
And we're always thrilled to have Richard and Missy here, and Richard did an incredible job for the Federal Reserve System and for the Dallas Fed for many years, and made it possible for the rest of us to follow and build on what he has helped achieve. So thank you for being here. And board, there we go. How many of you are coming to Dallas Fed for the first time? Okay, still, we get fewer hands every time, but that's great. And how many of you have been here before? All right, that's great. And you all know, you've heard the spiel, why we do these things. We want to invite people and open this place to the public so you'll understand the Fed and make this part of the community. So we're thrilled that you're here. And so without further ado, let me turn to you, Darren. Darren, how many people in this audience know Darren already?
Oh gosh, it's not.
Okay, so not as many as I would have thought, but a lot of people in this state and in this town know Darren. And I want to just start with a little bit of your story. We talked about, you grew up in Texas. How did you get from a small town in Texas to being CEO of the Ford Foundation? How would you describe your journey? And people must ask you about this all the time.
Well, they do. But first, I'm really happy to be home. It's always great to be in Texas. It is always, there remains something very unique about this place that is both exhilarating and confounding, and is on so many levels. For me, it's always joyous for me to come home. I think I have been extraordinarily blessed and fortunate, and my journey, I think, has been punctuated by generosity, by a tremendous amount of public investment in me and my own potential, and a lot of luck. And I think the three of those things have, I think, made it possible for me to go from Ames, Texas, and Liberty County to the Ford Foundation in Midtown Manhattan.
And you and I have talked about this before, but along the way, most important mentor you had that helped you maybe aim higher and see your life about what your life could be?
I think I've had a series of mentors, right? I mean, I have had people, when I was a kid, in a small town in Texas, where I think people saw my potential, but I had a very, very dysfunctional home situation, right? And so the fact that I think for many people, without outside mentorship, support, it's really quite easy to be overwhelmed, right? So, I mean, I think about when I got to Austin, Texas at the university, I had remarkable people like Shirley Bird Perry, who sort of took me under their wings and helped me understand what it meant to be a student leader and all of those things. And when I got to New York, there was a partner at Clary Gottlieb who really was, I arrived in New York City. I'd never been to New York City, and it was only my second time on an airplane. And so I show up at Clary Gottlieb in 1985 as a summer associate, really because I thought I would go to New York like lots of snarky second-year law students who say, I'm going to split my summer and I'm going to, just spend a few weeks in Texas because that's where I'm going to end up. And so why not have fun my second summer? So I did that, and I was in New York, and I fell in love with New York. But I had great mentorship in New York, both at Cleary and at UBS. And then I met the remarkable Calvin Butts, the head of the Abyssinian Church, who, really, Calvin made it possible for me to really think about the transition from Wall Street to Harlem. And then Vernon Jordan became a great mentor when I was in Harlem, and When I went to Rockefeller, he had been a Rockefeller trustee.
Right.
He had been a Ford trustee.
Right.
So I, along the way, just had remarkable people helping me. And without those people, I would not be here today.
And if you had to say most important lesson or lessons you learned along the way that you want to share?
I think the most important lesson for leadership, at least I have learned, is the quality of empathy. And I'm often asked, what job most prepared you for your current role? Because my current role is a role where it would be really quite easy for me to be comfortable and to believe that the reason my calendar is so full is because I'm so charming and smart and interesting, and not because I'm president of the Ford Foundation. And I know that it's because I'm president of the Ford Foundation. And that is informed in part by some degree of humility and a recognition, and really the best job that I ever had that prepared me for living in New York and the work that I do and the sort of circles I live in was when I was 14, I was a busboy. And that was the job that gave me insight into the world. Because when you are a busboy, you live on the margins and you are at the bottom next to the dishwasher. You're the bottom of the rung. And so you do everything from clean the bathrooms to bust the tables, and you circle the room, but you're totally invisible.
Right.
And so, and the people you're waiting on are all privileged, and to you, and to them often, you are invisible. And people look through you and not at you. And so what that does is it gives you a sense of what it must be like to live on the margins of society. And in my role today, I need that consciousness every day, because in a place like New York, and for some people in New York, some of us who live pretty privileged lives, like my friend Rob Kaplan, who live in big apartments on Fifth Avenue.
Those days are over.
Yes, well, there are a lot of people that you and I know then. You and I know who have big apartments on Fifth Avenue and houses in the Hamptons and all of those things who have no understanding of what it must be like to live on the margins.
That's true.
And so while we walk out of our nice buildings on the park and see people literally sleeping on the street, we can, if we choose, to just look through them and not understand and have a degree of empathy about them and their existence, because their existence is an existence without dignity.
Yeah.
And we all know the importance of dignity. And I think that job gave me a sensibility of what it is like to live without dignity.
Yeah. All right, so leading to that, your job at Ford Foundation. I knew being on the board of Ford Foundation, probably the first question people ask if they get up the nerve is, what does Ford Foundation do? So, because it's a household name, but a lot of people don't know what it actually does. We heard $13 billion endowment.
Thanks to your help on the investment committee.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Wish I could take credit for the market going up, but I can't. But what does the Ford Foundation do?
So the Ford Foundation is a philanthropy founded in 1936 by Edsel Ford, Henry's son, with the objective of working to support local Detroit philanthropy. Edsel Ford died unexpectedly in 1943 at the age of 49. And the foundation, the family, had a huge tax bill. So you're getting the full story that often the people don't fully get, but let's be transparent. So because of this huge tax liability, the IRS negotiated a transfer of a significant part of the privately held Ford Motor Company stock that was a part of Edsel's estate to the Ford Foundation. And the objective of the family was to retain control of the Ford Motor Company ultimately, because the family knew that the company would go public at some point. By having Henry Ford II, Edsel's son, chair the Ford Motor Company, which he became the chairman of, and chairman of the Ford Foundation, the family would in effect control the company when it went public, which it did for a number of years. But in transferring that stock to the Ford Foundation, and when the company went public in 1951, the Ford Foundation overnight became the largest foundation in the world, 3 times the size of Carnegie and Rockefeller combined.
Yeah.
And in the 1950s, when the company went public, within 5 years, the stock had doubled. And so the Ford Foundation became this behemoth of an institution that started to invest in really what we call human achievement. And that was across so many realms of the arts and science and humanities and international development. And the Ford Foundation, over the ensuing 30 years, really was involved, certainly domestically, in every facet of American life, from the civil rights movement to education reform to building hospitals and healthcare, all sorts of things that ultimately, as you know, led to Henry Ford's resignation, very public resignation from the foundation in 1976, because Henry believed that the foundation, the work of the foundation was not work that he could stand behind. And that work in particular were the things that caused problems for the company, which was primarily our work on civil rights, because the dealers in the American South got boycotted by Southerners who felt that the Ford Foundation's support for integration, our support for voting rights and things, litigation, made them unpopular in their local communities. And so Henry left, and we've not had a Ford involved, as you know, since then. When I became president, we really, for the first time, because the foundation became so diffused and because we had so many offices around the world, there was really not a coherent global strategy with one sort of guiding North Star as our objective. And we, with the good help of Rob and the other trustees, determined that among the threats that we could work on today that were barriers to the achieving our mission. Our mission is to reduce poverty, advance democratic societies and democratic institutions. The big threat was inequality, growing inequality. And so we work on reducing inequality because we believe that inequality is a threat to our democracy. Growing inequality correlates with growing hopelessness in a society. And this has been proven in many societies. When the citizenry believe that the bounties of their society are going to too few of their fellow citizens, they become cynical about their institutions. They become cynical about their own potential for advancing because they believe that their systems are rigged. And societies that believe that are societies that over time, opportunity as we know it and a sort of sense of optimism that we have, which is critical certainly in the United States, is really harmed by inequality. So inequality for us is the North Star, reducing it, addressing it across systems, because we believe that the drivers are systems. They're not one-off episodic things. We have systems that produce advantage for people like you and me and produce disadvantage for other people. those things don't just happen by osmosis. We have systems and policies that are designed to do certain things. We have a criminal justice system that was designed to criminalize certain Americans. If you look at the beginnings, the origins of the war on drugs, the original astounding communication between Richard Nixon and his team about why the war on drugs and the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, were created. It is shocking to hear Ehrlichman say, we have two enemies, hippies and Negroes. I mean, I'm telling you what the transcripts said. And we have to marginalize them. We have to criminalize them in some way so that their leaders can be delegitimized in the public's eye. And so it was a cynical effort that is well documented, and it has succeeded in criminalizing an entire population of Americans for low-level, nonviolent offenses. And that system reproduces. And so we look across all the systems that are supposed to work for our democracy. And what we do at the foundation is interrogate those systems and say, are you producing opportunity? Are you producing the chance for people to realize the American dream? And so whether it's the housing system, the education system, the transportation system, the criminal justice system, we're interested in how those systems are working for most Americans.
And then what you do, how do you make grants? Who do you give grants to in order to intervene in those systems?
So let's take the example of voting. So we believe that Henry's original idea that for our democracy to work, we need as many Americans as possible to vote. I mean, that was Henry Ford's idea, right? That was an apolitical, we should want that, right? I mean, who would wish that fewer Americans should vote? Well, there actually are people who would wish that fewer Americans. And so we have a voting system. And so we support those organizations who are on the front lines fighting to ensure that more Americans and every American has an opportunity to vote. So we do things that sometimes are not popular. For example, grantees like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was a part of a lawsuit in Harris County, Texas, to challenge the bail system. Yeah. Because there is a bail system in this country that is a profiteering system that is pernicious and profits from poverty and people's misery. So the federal court agreed with our grantee that the system was biased, the bail system was biased. It was appealed to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit affirmed the lower court. And so the idea that we can actually end for a low-level offense, let's just say you've shoplifted, right, and you go to jail and you can't leave jail because you don't have $500 to post bail. Right. So you stay in a county jail, costing all of us, right, and costing yourself and your family because you lose your job, you obviously lose income or any right to housing and the things that, so it becomes this spiraling. And so we are supporting those organizations. We're supporting organizations in Florida who are doing the same thing to challenge. We're supporting organizations in Ohio where there is policy to reduce the hours that a polling station is open. Why would you proactively reduce the hours a polling station is opened? Who would wish that? obviously there are people who do wish that.
So just to give people a sense, so the number of people working at the Ford Foundation today is approximately
500.
500. So your program officers are scouring the world for these issues,
And
looking
working
for
with organizations. Yeah.
And you're empowering those organizations, giving them grants, helping them build capacity to address these issues.
Absolutely. We invest in three things: institutions, individuals, and ideas, because those are the three components that we know will sustain change. And so the same organization, the Legal Defense Fund that I just said, filed the case, in Harris County in 2018. That same organization we were funding in, Thurgood Marshall in 1962 to fund a poll tax case in Mississippi, right? That same institution that we've been funding all those years, because institutions in a democracy matter. For rule of law to work, there has to be a robust and vibrant civil society.
And if Ford wasn't doing this, who would be doing it? Who else is doing what Ford is doing?
Yeah, I think there are lots of donors who are moving in this direction. In fact, I just last week was in Silicon Valley, and there was 20. I organized a meeting, and there were 20 West Coast philanthropists who turned up for this criminal justice meeting, where you had everyone from the founders of Facebook and people, Snap, and all these companies were these young billionaires who, when they look at something like the bail system, they are completely perplexed that we would have this, and they're outraged, which is a good thing.
Yep. So when you look at the world today, and obviously the Ford Foundation does this globally.
Yeah.
What's the biggest issue you see that I can guess what your answer is, because you and I've talked about this a lot. What's the biggest thing you see right now that concerns you? Biggest burning issue that you feel like for the health and welfare and prosperity of our country and our world, we need to address this? What's the biggest thing that you see that concerns you?
Well, I think the thing that I worry about most is, across the many places we work, the growing sense of hopelessness. And I certainly, in the United States, I firmly believe I love my country. And the reason I get so agitated is because we can do better. I know we can do better.
Yeah.
I do not think that our greatest threat is terrorism or a pandemic. Our greatest threat is hopelessness, because when people are hopeless, they do desperate things. And why not? And when we look in other places in the world, you can see what happens. This is the thing about working at a place like Ford. You can look back and you remember in a country like Uganda, a country like Zimbabwe, that 20 years ago were on the cusp of remarkable transformation.
Yep.
And for a set of reasons that are now clear, these countries are basket cases.
Yeah.
Mugabe was the it boy for the World Bank and the whole international order. And look at what he has done to that country. And you see all of the things that he's done to that country. And you look from Venezuela, you can look across so many countries where we work. And, I could just give you chapter and verse, because it's the same things happening.
Yeah.
It's a movement of populism. It's a set of leaders who take advantage of people's sense of hopelessness and turn them inward and against each other. And while the institutions of democracy are assaulted, whether that be the media, institutions like universities are delegitimized, because these despots see that if they can delegitimize the institutions of democracy, the citizenry will let them get away with the things that despots do. And, you can travel to lots of places in the world where the Ford Foundation works, and you see how the picture ends. And it's really not a good one. And so our job and my concern in the world is the way in which, whether you're in India or in parts of Latin America, certainly parts of Africa, where, and of course, how could we forget the Middle East, and particularly Egypt, where, these institutions are under assault. and they're under assault because they represent the people.
Yeah.
And so civil society, which to me is the sort of lifeblood of a democracy, is under assault in all of these places.
So we've got a group of obviously active citizens here, community leaders. If you had to give one piece of advice to people in this audience on what they can do personally to address this, what would your advice be?
Well, I think the things that we need to do are to get more people in the room. You know, it's very interesting. I was at the University of Arkansas a couple of weeks ago giving a talk, and I'd gone to Crystal Bridges, the museum in Bentonville that my friend Alice Walton organized, and it's just this amazing museum, which is, again, I mean, here's Alice's view that why should people in Northwest Arkansas have to come to Dallas to go to a decent museum, right? I mean, and it's true, right? I mean, because why can't they have a great museum? And so she took it upon herself to build a world-class museum that a lot of people on the East and West Coast said that she was like a nutcase. And why would she spend, hundreds of millions of dollars on this museum, this world-class museum in the middle of nowhere? And so you go to this place and you see somebody addressing inequality. You see, because when you go to that museum and you see people, all kinds of people in Northwest Arkansas at this amazing world-class museum where they are seeing they don't need to come to Dallas. Sorry, they don't need to come to New York. And good for them. And so what I saw there, and what reminds me of this issue was a talk in a room like this where a person got up and said, because it was about the housing crisis. They're on their way to a housing crisis in Bentonville, and this person said, why aren't there more diverse people in the room? This person was a community person who said, this is the problem in our community. We all turn up, but we all know each other, but then there are black, brown, poor people, all kinds of people who aren't here. How do we get them in the room? And that is really the challenge, right? That's the opportunity that we have to. And it is not easy because most of those people aren't like us. I mean, my mother would have never attended a community meeting. She never had time. She was working. And I think that's the way most people that's the way most people I'm concerned about live their lives. They don't live their lives where they have the privilege of turning up at a community board meeting or a city council meeting to advocate for something. So how do we think about using our privilege, right? So for me, the point of the privilege that we have, because I've lived with privilege and without it, and it is really good to live with privilege. It is, no, I say that I don't mean that in a snarky way. I mean it to say, I think about my privilege and how many people don't have my privilege. And so how do we use our privilege to talk about the issues that matter to people who don't possess our privilege? Right. So my advice to people is, think about your privilege. How do you use that for others, not to compound, your own privilege? When I see friends of yours and mine in New York who, in the midst of a tax bill rewrite, are working hard to ensure that there is the continued treatment of carried interest, I'm appalled. Okay. No, and I'm appalled because I say to myself, in the middle of this moment, we, all of us, are going to go to compound our privilege.
So your advice to people, get out, get in the community and help someone else.
And not help someone. No. Because this is the difference between how we think about philanthropy, right?
Yes.
Just
stop. There are a number of nonprofit leaders in this room who've been backed and empowered and capacity built by people in this room. And so that's how many people here are as you would say, using their privilege to build this community.
And funding organizations that actually sometimes make us uncomfortable.
Okay.
Because I think ultimately, philanthropy, in my view, is not about generosity. Sure. It's about justice.
Yep.
And if philanthropy has as its purpose justice, Dr. King in 1968 said to a group of philanthropists, what he said was, philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to ignore the very injustices that make philanthropy necessary. And what he was saying was, it's not about charity, and it's not about you, actually. And it should be about the people who you need to help. And many of them are in the situations that they are in, not because they made a bad choice but because there is injustice in the world. And if you take on the question of justice as a philanthropist, it'll lead you down some interesting paths.
So let's take some questions from the audience. For those who have questions, feel free to work your way to the microphone, please. Go ahead.
Darren, in preparation for hearing you today, I read an article which I can't stress enough that everyone should read. And it's called A Call for Moral Courage in America. And it's an article you wrote 6 months ago. And I've never read anything like it since Martin Luther King's 63 Birmingham jail speech. You all have to read this article. It's so powerful. You mentioned John Ehrlichman before, and your article clearly takes aim at where we are in the leadership in our government right now. How do you speak and get your message to the John Ehrlichmans of today?
So I think that it is unfortunate that we have constructed these binaries that make every position one takes oppositional, and so I like to think that I live in a world of gray, because I think most problem solving is not done from a paradigm of black or white. The problem solving is done in the middle, by compromise and by understanding. And I think the challenge today is that we have created this sort of way of looking at issues and each other in really oppositional ways, with litmus tests around that. And if you're either for me or against me, you're for something or you're against something. And I think the way we leaders, and all of us, and I hope, in that essay I was trying to, I didn't mention the president. I didn't, because I didn't want to make it a political piece, because I wanted to hopefully appeal to people who might be like John Ehrlichman and might see the just un-American way in which some of these issues are being addressed. So I guess what I'm saying is, as I said in the essay, it is about what are the kinds of leaders our society needs today. Because I believe we need leaders who are interested in building bridges, not walls, and who see the necessity of the healing that needs to happen, rather than exacerbating the fissures that we live with every day. And to see that the fabric of our country, what our founding fathers talked about when they talked about the fabric of America, was one where the Commonwealth and the ideas of that bind us together is what we should be all working towards, recognizing that we are different and that there are differences among us. Absolutely there are differences, but are they so profound that we are unable to be civil, that we are unable to treat each other with a level of dignity and respect, simply because we may disagree?
Yeah, go ahead. Here on the side.
Okay. If equality is the if equality is the North Star for the Ford Foundation, where does liberty stand?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and it's something that I in that essay wrote about because Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to one of his French friends after he'd returned from Paris, wrote a wonderful essay where he talked about the work of America was to build a country of justice and liberty. And in a diverse country like America, liberty is not a defined term. Because in a country like America with our history, liberty feels like oppression to some. And I use examples of let's just say, I was in a conversation once with a friend who said, I hate the federal government. And he said, I hate the federal government. And he had very strong reasons, and I really listened to him. And because one of the things about trying to be empathetic is that you actually try to put yourself in another person's shoes, right? And so, he's a pretty successful white guy who is a libertarian and so for him it's about liberty, and I can understand that. And I said to him, well, you should understand that for African Americans, it was the federal government that saved us. I mean, the states wished to continue the racist policies that had characterized life for most African Americans in the American South. And so what some people said was liberty, the right to live in a state and to have states' rights through a notion of liberty, was actually oppression to another group of Americans. And so the work of democracy, and the amazing thing about this country, is the reconciliation of those two ideas of liberty and those two lived experience for two legitimate populations of Americans who both want liberty. And so to many Southerners we have a wonderful trove of hate mail the Ford Foundation has received over the years, and there's one category of just hate mail from the South. And I don't mean that in a bad way. As a Southerner, I don't mean that. I'm not. But as a Southerner, it is because there was so much mail that came to the foundation during a period of time that the Ford Foundation, was a threat to American liberty. And at the same time, we have these letters from Martin Luther King and the Southern Leadership Conference and all of these people saying, thank you for making it possible for us to have freedom. And so it's the wonderful thing about this country is that the work of democracy making is figuring that all out. And that's what we have to all be, I think, committed to.
All right, let's take some few more questions.
Byron Sanders, I'm the CEO of Big Thoughts, and we do a lot of work in the education space, youth development, creativity. And one of our programs is Creative Solutions that deals with adjudicated youth. And it's fantastic because we have a fantastic recidivism rate, but the challenge is before they get to our doorstep, right? And let's say even after they engage with their first part of the criminal justice system, public defenders, district attorneys, it seems as though there's a almost a inverted or perverse system of incentives to push for a certain set of solutions as opposed to doing what's best for maybe that individual or for society, such as district attorneys run on the case of how tough against crime they've been, right? When in fact, I think we all know that we spend more money in incarceration rates, in recidivism. What are some places in some cities, potentially some municipalities or systems across the country that you all have funded that have been able to turn some of those perverse incentives on their head so that the systems themselves and the people working within them are in their own Machiavellian way, incentivized to do things that are in the best interest of justice, individuals, young people, and those, and I would say generally society?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are places, the research is really clear. I mean, this is where, when you say, let's look at the evidence, and then the politics come into, right? So the research is really clear that diversion strategies work, that particularly for young people who commit a low-level, nonviolent, first time, for example, offense, that rather than having them at a county jail or in an incarcerated system, a diversion strategy, and what I mean by diversion is a system that allows them to have some supervision, that allows them to do community service, but that does not incarcerate them and permanently mark them as a criminal. And so we know that. Unfortunately, the language of law and order appeals to some people. And so the work has to be looking at places where over time it's been proven that these strategies work. The thing that I always stress from New York is that I don't want to talk about systems that work in New York and San Francisco, right? I mean, I was just in San Francisco on Friday, and I went to San Quentin, and the group of men, I sat in a circle with 20 guys who every one of them was sentenced to from 25 to life when they were 16, 17, or 18. And the stories about how they got into those systems that got them ensnarled and that got them to a place where they actually, at 16, were basically, given a life sentence. Was a series of things, including bad choices. So let's talk about personal responsibility. Absolutely, that led them to that moment. And you just think about that had they been young people in the last 10 years and had committed that first offense, because now in the state of California, you can't sentence a 16-year-old to life in prison. They would have had a different outcome, I think. And so I think we can look in places like California. But what I'm really interested in is supporting those models in the South and in the Midwest, in high incarceration states like Ohio, Louisiana, Texas, where there is innovation going on, and the notion that these are places that, which people on the East and West Coast sometimes like to propagate, that these backwater places where people are still so backward looking about these things, is just not true. Because there's real, as I said, just down in Harris County, there is real innovation going on around changing the system.
Let's take one over here.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Kaplan. Thank you, Mr. Walker, for all your good works.
Thank you.
That's great. You did bring up using privilege as a tool. How have you learned from your background and dysfunctionality? I'm assuming it's, personally speaking, some sort of jail, drugs, crime of some sort, and broken homes, something like that. How have you learned how to express that, being humble in your attitude for the privilege to use that as a tool?
Right. Well, I think it's, I have this metaphor because something happened to me when I first moved to New York, and I was at the firm, and there was a woman who took care of all the young associates when we came to the firm. And so, she says to me one day, go to Citibank, and you have to do your banking, you have to do whatever. And at that time, Citibank was at 55 Wall, which is now Cipriani, as you know. And so so I turn up at 55 Wall Street to what was then, First City National Bank headquarters. And you go in, and to me, from Austin, Texas, it was this big place. And there was a line, and I get in the line, and I am, there's my little packet, and, going to the teller, and this lady's walking around, and she says, "Can I help you?" And I said, I have to open an account, and I'm from Cleary Gottlieb, and I gave her my little thing in the letter, and she looks at me and she's like, "Oh, sir, you're in the wrong line." And so she takes me away, and she says, "Please come with me." And so, she takes me up those stairs, that big stairs at 55 Wall Street, and she takes me to this thing called a private bank. Well, the only bank I had known was the Student Credit Union at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas, right? And so this lady takes me to this thing called, and she walks me into the private bank. And this person sits me down and basically tells me that I'm opening this account, I'm going to save money there, but like I can bounce checks, I can get all these things, and it doesn't cost me anything. And that it is like completely, and it was the whole thing that in my mind, the things that I had, it was, and she was basically saying, okay, you should understand, you are transitioning, you are now going to be privileged. And for people like you, yes, people like you can like bounce a check and we'll pay it. And you can, no, seriously, it was like a metaphor. It was like this wake-up call. Yeah. And so when I think about my privilege and I think about how I like try to like keep a modicum of, I just have these experiences. And I can go on forever and ever, but I have one more story like this. No, and it's really so poignant because my friends who live in New York know that we're out every night and it's busy. My friends Suzanne and Patrick McGee and Dan Relman are here and they know because when they're in New York, we're out every night and we go to galas and we go to parties and we go to these things and you sometimes can live in this world. And so fortunately, I am able to stay grounded because I have a family that is still here and still in small town Louisiana who are dealing with real issues, right? That real people who, like most Americans, are dealing with. And so I am literally, a year ago, I'm on the board of Carnegie Hall. I'm going into Carnegie Hall for the opening night, the hall. And, I get a text from my sister saying, we're at Aunt Bertha's funeral. It was today, but Mom wanted to show you this photo because, and so of cousin Buster. And so she forwards me the picture, and it is a picture of my cousin who is at his mother's funeral in an orange prison uniform. He is standing in front of her casket, in front of the church, in an Angola prison uniform, because in the state of Louisiana, you are allowed to attend the funeral of a loved one, but you must be accompanied by a marshal, and you are not allowed to put on street clothes. So you have moments like that in your life. And here I am in black tie with my dear date, Jesse Norman, on my hand. We're walking in and I'm like reading this and having a moment where I literally am like experiencing profound dissonance. Because you see how people live without dignity, people who are close to you. And so to me, staying proximate to these issues and not allowing yourself to not be proximate allows you to stay a little humble about things.
So, because we're short on time, so the Ford Foundation and you personally, and I know this over the years, spend an enormous amount of time on bridging the digital divide, education, many other social justice issues. And while there's some things that concern you in the world, what's the most hopeful thing you see that keeps you going, that says, you know what, we're making progress here?
Every day I find reasons for hope. So I am a hopeless hopeaholic. Working at the Fort, every day you get to meet these remarkable people who are changing the world. And so for me, I every day see it. It's why I love doing commencements, because many of you are parents and have been to graduations of your kids. You go and you spend a day or two with these young people and you say, the world's gonna be okay. We need to just get out of the way, because these young people are fearless about changing the world. And so that gives me enormous joy and hope for the future. Technology gives me hope, and it also is scary. Right? And it gives me hope because I believe in, as you know, our fellow trustee at the Ford Foundation, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web. Tim's vision for the web, the internet to be a platform for opportunity, right? And it can be. It can also be a platform that just transfers all of the injustice in the analog world onto a digital world. And so the work, as you know, of the foundation is to help ensure that we have a free and fair and open internet, and that people use it as a place for opportunity, and not a place to help undermine and destroy democracies who you don't like.
The biggest, most promising trend you see in education? Obviously, we talk about early childhood literacy, poor college readiness in this country. We're behind, as you and I've talked a lot about, in skills in this country. Where do you see this going, and what do you see that's hopeful out there, and where we're making progress?
So I don't have a conventional education. So if you want my real answer,
I do.
I think the way we're going to potentially transform the education system, because if we are honest with ourselves and we look at the data and we disaggregate the data, particularly
By
in
race?
this country,
Yeah.
by race, we know where the challenges are,
Yeah.
right? So you just got back from some OECD meeting, and I'm sure they were showing the latest data on where the U.S.
So just for the group, and we talk about this a lot here at the Dallas Fed, the educational, we do because we do research on it, the fastest growing demographic groups in the country, blacks and Hispanics, have lagging early childhood literacy, educational attainment levels. But the trends are that group will ultimately be the majority demographic group eventually in this country. And I see Todd Williams here in the audience, who is a leader in this, among other people, unless we improve early childhood literacy and get kids earlier, it's going to affect prosperity for the country.
Well, in those OECD rankings, I don't know where we've fallen now to
25th out of 35.
Right, but if you actually.
By the way, our research is if we could just improve, and we're relying on if we could just improve to the average of the OECD, it would raise potential GDP in this country. You know, some studies have assessed by as much as 0.4 or 0.5 of a point. That's a gigantic number. We're lagging. One of the reasons we're lagging is because we're lagging in education, and we've got to fix it.
Right, and so when we disaggregate the data, we know that it's a group of dropout factory schools, and we know that the primary underachievers are African American primarily, and Latino, and boys more than girls. So why don't we focus, right? So
Who do you see making progress on this?
my answer to that is stop locking up all their fathers, right? Because I think the part of the challenge for our educational system is not our educational system. It's the home life of these children who live. I mean, I live without a father. I understand the potential for dysfunction, but if you compound that by overlaying a system that is more likely to ensnarl people and then not make it possible for them to re-enter and be in any way meaningful to their families, you create sort of what we've got.
So,
And I know that's not sort of the usual education.
no, that's all right.
I always get in trouble.
So let's
for saying these things,
take
but
one or
whatever.
two more, and then we're going to make this brief because we're going to need to wrap up
I'll
in a
try
few
to make
minutes.
it brief, but Darren, a little bit more challenging question to you. I read an article too in preparation about the Ford Foundation. This is not an indictment, it's a critique. This one happens to be by a guy named David Callahan, who wrote a really nice book called The Givers about
Yes.
philanthropy. And he starts off, in fact, the headline is Ford Foundation spends over $1 billion in the last 10 years on its overhead. Did they really do the right thing? And my question to you really is, the great concern, you say justice, we hear social justice, we hear, and we all know, and we're all worried about inequality in America. Why don't you get rid of all your overseas, cut your staff hugely, make bigger grants and make a bigger impact, and make some headlines for yourself, make a bigger impact for the good of our country?
So thank you for that. And David Callahan is actually a friend of mine, and he's an example of someone who I don't always agree with, but he is one of the smartest people I know, and because of that, and I love engaging with him, which I do a lot. So just on your first point, it is true that we, over 10 years, spent $1 billion on overhead, because in that same period, we gave away $8 billion. And so if you look at that ratio, it is not out of whack. And if you recognize that we do have a set of offices around the world that do cost us to operate, because it is expensive in some markets to operate. I would say that the reason we would not close our foreign offices is because when we were chartered, Henry Ford said that we would be an international foundation, because he believed, as I believe, that institutions in the United States, like the Ford Foundation, have a role to play in the world. And to the extent that American institutions and America retreats from standing for something in the world, it will ultimately be harmful to America. And so I believe fervently that we should continue our work internationally. And I'm pleased that, more importantly, my board believes that, because ultimately the problems of America cannot be walled off from the rest of the world. And if we are to be a better America, we have to contribute to a better world. And institutions like the Ford Foundation and the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, who work in the United States and work internationally, I think rightly believe that we can play a role in that objective.
So we could continue this conversation for a couple of more hours, but we're going to mill around a little bit here afterwards. Darren,
Thank
you
you
for your
President
leadership.
Kaplan.
Thank you for
Great
all
to
you
see
do.
you.
Thank you for being here.